Ok, bonsoir tout le monde et merci d'avance.
Good afternoon. Thank you for attending. Today we discuss a topic. We discuss the star of our era, that is artificial intelligence. Right, I'll start again. I was saying, good afternoon. Thank you for being with us. My name is Claude Tadonki. I'm a researcher at the Research Center of MIN Paris-PSL, and I focus on high performance calculation, HPC. But I'm only a facilitator today. The substantial topic we tend to use AI more and more, and there are more and more users. So if you combine both, you have an intensive use of AI. And I would also add that AI has this application spectrum that broadens every day. So if you sum up all factors, issues of needs and availability rise. And for performance, you need energy. You need energy to run the data centers needed when you send prompts to the AI machine. But so, of course, there are also environmental concerns at stake. These changes lead to geopolitical changes too. AI can be used for sovereignty, for vulnerability management, in power plays. So we brought together a panel to address those issues. We have Chloé-Agathe Azencott. She specializes in AI-related matters. She will try and give you an overview of the topic. She will share insights for us to better understand the discussion that will follow. We have Éric Masanet with us too. He will address the issue of energy. How energy intensive is AI and what are the consequences? And we also have Aymeric with us, and he will discuss one particular case, and that is geology. So the use of AI in science and in geology, and he represents Lithosquare. And we have Henri with us, Executive Director of the Inria Foundation. And so he will talk about sovereignty, the vulnerabilities, and then we'll conclude the panel discussion. Those were a few words about the format, and we will have two driving questions, or two threads. We'll try and answer the potential questions you might have at the end. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Chloé-Agathe Azencott, professor at the MIN Paris. She did her thesis in California, and she now deals with AI issues or AI work at the MIN Paris. She will give us an overview. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Well, that is quite a task I have. Defining AI. I'm given 5 minutes, but I was able to write a whole thesis on it. I'll try to be as clear as possible, and I'll start by defining what we call machine learning, statistical learning. That is perhaps the key component of AI, and it led to AI evolving over the past few years. And it's what will perhaps be the most relevant to discuss the energy cost. So machine learning is this idea that we build models, statistical models, so not based on knowledge, but based on data. And let me give you an example. If I wanted to build a program to know if a photograph is the photo of a cat or not, well, instead of determining the properties or the characteristics of the photo, I will use an algorithm, a machine learning-based algorithm, and I will feed example photos into it, photos of cats, photos that are not of cats, and I will get a model that gives me the likelihood of a cat being on the photo. How does the algorithm proceed? Well, the general idea is that you get a range, a class of models. So you have parameters, so tools you can adjust, and the way these values are adjusted is in order to minimize error making based on the input data. So we adjust a model to avoid mistakes. And again, the goal is to determine if there's a cat or not on the photo. So you can adjust those parameters, and you have generative models, and in that case, we're not trying to see if there's a cat or not, but rather you can generate new examples of cat photographs, and you can extend that and go further. And that is what is at the core of generative AI, model development, what we're probably all interested in today. And so we can generate words, word sequences, pixels that are the most likely in a given context. Hence, all the tools we now have. And so they're basically auto-completion tools on steroids. So we're building probability models using input data. Now, what is important to remind ourselves is that the more data you have, the more examples can be used. And it helps you cover even more areas. So taking the example of the cat photo, if you have several cat species, different kinds of cats, then the more likely the model can capture what a cat is. And the second thing is having more data helps improve the models, and they can help build more complex models too. So I was saying we have parameters we can adjust. Well, the more parameters you have, the more data you need to adjust them. If you've done a bit of physics, then that's the level, the degree of liberty, of freedom. If you have more parameters, then you can navigate a high number of solutions, and you have more parameters you can adjust. What I would say is important before we begin our discussion on the energy cost of machine learning. Well, first, there are a lot of applications of machine learning that do not require as much data as that. I've worked in machine learning for years for genome applications. We have data sets with hundreds and perhaps thousands of patients. So that's rather limited sort of data sets. Some applications need more data. A foundation model, for example, to modelize certain images for a cancer treatment or a cancer research. Optimus is a recent example, and it was trained using 1 million of images. It's difficult to measure the scale of some data sets used for large models, ChatGPT and others. We know the Llama series models a bit better, and so Llama 3 was launched 2 years ago, I believe, and it was trained using 11 trillion words. So, you know, we deal with millions, but in this case, we're dealing with a much higher number of data. But this is not the case for all applications. And this very intensive use, by the way, you know, it requires a lot of energy, water, rare minerals. So it is a part of the machine learning use, but it isn't everything. And I should add that a small number of companies, mostly American companies, are the ones involved in that intensive use. But of course, that's perhaps a political discussion. I'm done here. Thank you so much, Chloe. As you will have seen, AI is a topic where we've witnessed a real boom. And AI is used in our daily lives and in many sectors. So Chloe said it. AI means energy consumption. You need electricity for data centers, namely. And the machines release heat. They require cooling systems, so there's this snowball effect and a high energy consumption. And as we've heard, there are many applications, so we can expect that this will be a priority in the field of science for many years. So it is a timely discussion to be had. And with climate change and the other challenges, it must be a priority. We'll give the floor to Éric Masanet. Éric Masanet has slides, so he will be speaking in English.
But you speak in English, no? You present. Yeah, okay. Donc, tu présenteras.
En anglais, s'il vous plaît. J'ai besoin de parler en anglais, mais
I need to speak in English, but I just wanted to say that I lived here in Paris for 2 years, 10 years ago. I really tried. I did my best to learn French, but you know that was in my office. Everyone spoke English, but my young children back then speak French fluently, and I'm quite proud to say that.
I wish I could give the whole presentation in French, but and I have some slides. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the situation for data centers in the United States, where I have been studying the energy use of this sector for nearly 20 years. And for many years, the growth there was fairly stable and fairly predictable, but this is no longer the case due to the AI boom. And as you can see here in this figure, we have a sense of just how quickly things are changing in the data center sector in the United States. So for many years, we had very steady capacity additions, but due to the AI boom, which occurred around 2022, data center builds are exploding quite rapidly, where we're seeing now 10 to 20 times the amount of data center announcements over the past few years than we saw for the previous 20 years. In many ways, this is somewhat of a grand experiment that's playing out in the United States, and I think there are lessons to be learned here for the rest of the world. So data centers are expanding much faster than renewable energy can be added to the grid. They're being built with many details being held secret from the local communities who are located next to data centers And as a result, these communities are starting to push back on the data center industry. And policymakers around the country, as you'll see, are really scrambling to make sense of this sector and to put in place policies that will steer it in the desired directions, ideally for sustainability, but also to achieve some other objectives like national competitiveness and competitive leadership. But in my view, there are lessons to be learned from what's happening in the United States, and I'd like to share some of them with you. Now, to give you a sense of the overall scale, these are some results from our latest U.S. National Data Center Report, which we conducted for the U.S. Congress as part of my role at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And as you can see from the trajectory, it used to be that data centers were fairly manageable from a grid perspective, but this is no longer the case. We expect data centers to rise to about 7 to 12% of national electricity demand by 2028. We're already in 2026. This is only 2 years away. And more recent projections suggest that that growth could be even greater by 2030. Grids in many parts of the country can't keep up with this new demand, with interconnect queues being delayed by 3 years, 7 years, up to 10 years in some parts of the country. And at the same time, as you see in the bottom graph, the industry is becoming a lot more consolidated. So what does this mean? It means that 10, 15 years ago, there were many data center operators operating many small data centers. These days, most of the growth is being driven by a handful of large companies, as you see in the graph. These are large hyperscalers, large co-location operators, and these are companies with a lot of resources. So what's happening is they are bypassing the grid delays. They're not waiting to build their data centers. This is a graph from a recent New York Times article which shows, by way of bubbles, the number of large data center projects that are being built, and the ones that are coded in blue are ones that are installing their own on-site natural gas generators. So they're no longer waiting for the grid. They are now installing their own on-site generation, and these generators are generally much smaller, much less efficient, and much more polluting than their counterparts on the grid. So it's moving the data center sector in the wrong direction from a sustainability perspective. And as a result, communities are really starting to push back in the US. So 2 key trends I'd like to communicate are, number one, many communities around the country are starting to ban data centers or delay data centers. By some accounts, tens of billions of dollars of data center projects in the United States have either been blocked or delayed due to communities who are concerned about growing air pollution, about rising electricity rates, about the water demands of data centers, about noise concerns, about a host of other environmental issues that they don't want to bear. And they're also concerned about a few tech companies getting very rich, while they are the ones who have to bear the environmental and economic burdens of the data centers themselves. And due in part to these community pressures, local policymakers are beginning to act. So my lab has a global database of policies which we track around the environmental regulations and policies for data centers. And as you'll notice here in this graph, this light blue area, oh, here we go. These are the policies that are emerging at the levels of US states. So in the United States, many policies are enacted at the state or local levels. We don't have many policies, especially not with this administration, at the federal level. So we're seeing a lot of action at the state level where state courthouses, state legislatures are looking to enact more sustainability guardrails around the data center sector. And in these trends, we're starting to see some possibilities for how we can bend the curve towards more sustainable AI. So despite where the data center sector seems to be headed in the US, we are seeing signs that there are technologies and policies that can put us on a better direction. And I would like to just summarize 7 key conditions which I communicate to policymakers when I speak to them about how we can make AI more sustainable in the United States. So the first, as Chloe mentioned, is that we don't need large models for most tasks where we can apply artificial intelligence or machine learning, right? We don't need models that are trained on trillions of parameters. In fact, for many problems that we need to solve, much smaller models that are purpose-built, trained more efficiently on smaller data sets, are more than sufficient, and these models can be used with a lot less energy and resulting carbon and pollution impacts. The second is that siting is critically important. So in the US, we're moving in the wrong direction when it comes to siting. Data centers are being sited in areas where there aren't sufficient renewables and often in areas with water stress. But if we can site new data centers where we have access to renewable energy, where they're in cool climates potentially for efficient cooling, as Claude mentioned, and where there's access to water and so forth, these data centers can have a much smaller environmental footprint. The third condition is that these data centers must be subject to very stringent efficiency standards. There are industry standard metrics like PUE, power usage effectiveness, WE, and so forth. The goal is to make sure that for every watt that is expended at these data centers, we maximize the computing efficiency. And this could be done through minimum efficiency standards that will be set on data centers. We don't yet have those in the United States. So they seem to be coming in some of the policies we're monitoring. But I have seen some movement, especially here in the EU, to devise data center efficiency ratings, which will be very important. Because when we're talking about gigawatt scale data centers, these are enormous. Every little bit of efficiency matters. We can save a lot of energy through efficiency. The fourth is that these large data centers are now making waste heat recovery economically viable. In the past, with air-cooled data centers being very small, there was always waste heat, but it was very difficult to reuse that waste heat in an economical way. Now that we're seeing very large data centers that are generating a lot of heat in a very confined space, it opens up the possibility for reusing that heat for district heating or on-site cooling or direct air capture. There are many options which could be pursued to recover waste heat on-site that we should be pushing for. The fifth condition is ensuring utility grid resilience. This means data centers adopting on-site storage for electricity, using renewable energy from the grid to charge on-site storage. When the grid is stressed or at peak or using fossil fuel generation, use the batteries. Allow for demand flexibility. The sixth condition relates to transparency. So it may seem a bit counterintuitive, but for the internet, which generates most of the data we use as a society, analysts like me have very few data, and this is because most companies don't report on their environmental footprint. So we need much greater transparency, and I think that will also enable local communities to have much better conversations with operators. Seventh, we need some visibility on the potential benefits of AI. I would be remiss if I just painted AI data centers as villains destroying the climate, destroying the planet. There's a lot of potential for AI in the right applications to solve many environmental problems, but we don't have good data, we don't have good frameworks, we don't have good standards for measuring benefits so we can calculate the net effects of AI. Is it good? Is it bad? Where might these effects play out? How can we steer AI applications to maximize benefits and minimize impacts? And then the eighth recommendation relates to what you and I could do as consumers. So we don't yet have ratings or good standards for measuring the environmental intensity of a ChatGPT query versus a Claude query versus a Gemini query. Hopefully those will be coming, but we can look to the companies that are doing these 7 things as proxies for the organizations that we should be procuring data center services from. And we should be very conscious about our use of AI and the sort of models we use and look for these characteristics in the services that we demand. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Claude.
Thank you very much, Éric. Donc, vous l'aurez compris, donc je vais reprendre en français. Que les questions énergétiques liées à l'IA, c'est vraiment
Energy and AI
assez large dans les aspects qu'on peut
quite
considérer.
a large question. Many aspects can be looked into, and there are solutions, and they're already being looked into. And we all agree that the implementation of those solutions will have implications, even if you just take the last point, asking consumers to act wisely. It means it's also in your hands, because we do virtually everything nowadays using AI tools. But there might be other ways or ways to be more moderate in our use. So it's a matter of behavior. And then there are all the aspects which are related to the use and production of energy, of power. So there are solutions, but they're not always easy to implement. The same goes for data centers. some countries decided to outsource their data centers, but that brings about geopolitical issues. So there are solutions, thank you, Éric, but implementing them will be the problem. We may come back to that after we've heard Aymeric and Henri. So over to Aymeric. He's going to be discussing possible compromises, trade-offs, and his example will be research in geology.
Merci Claude, bonjour à tous.
Well, thank you, Claude. Good afternoon, everybody.
Oui. Alors effectivement, tout à l'heure, Claude a donné l'exemple de
Claude
Biooptimus, qui est
gave the example of Biooptimus, which is applied to medical use at Lithosquare. It's also very much applied, but applied to geology and the specificities of geological data and mineral research. With critical and strategic metals. To tie in with this morning's discussion,
la mission de Lithosquare, c'est
de
faire nous-mêmes de l'exploration minière.
Carries out its own mining exploration, but we do it totally differently because the development of technologies is at the heart of what we do, and human expertise. We recruited people to identify targets
L'objectif, c'est évidemment de répondre aux enjeux qui ont été évoqués
and
ce matin,
deposits.
de besoins en métaux critiques et stratégiques pour
there is this need, as we said this morning, for these materials. It's usually approach industrially $350 million will be lacking, which means about 1,000 sites, production sites will have to be found by 2040 in order to meet the energy and digital needs. And so it's a different type of application of use of AI. And once again, what we want to do is focus on the data, the geological maps, etc. So we have an IA which can help geologists find the necessary sites better and faster, and the metals necessary for the energy and environmental transition. Now, before I look at the rollout aspects of AI, I'd like to come back to what Éric was saying. You have to remember that all this is highly dynamic, it goes really fast. And the impression can be that a little overwhelmed by developments, but you can be a player. There is AI, it can be used in the designing of public policies, and I think that it's important to recall that. So this also ties in with what was said this morning. If you look at what data centers consume, it's still relatively moderate, but it's growing rapidly. This means that if we want these data centers to be decarbonated, we need more copper, for instance. And if you look at the gap by 2040, we see that there's going to be a competition with users for transition. So if we want AI which is as decarbonated as possible, off the grid with gas turbines, with the smallest possible impact, you have to find sufficient metals to connect these data centers to the grid.
Donc sur la gauche, vous avez le nombre de turbines à gaz qui sont
So
déployées aux
number of
États-Unis,
gas
et la part des
turbines
turbines
in
à
the
gaz qui sont
US
utilisées pour
and
les
the
data
share
centers,
used
et
for
en
data
production aux
centers.
États-Unis.
You have
Donc,
the
véritablement
figures
une
here, the
explosion des
projection.
turbines à gaz utilisées pour
So
les data centers.
a very
Les
steep
hyperscalers
increase,
n'attendent pas. Ils développent leurs projets, et quand c'est
projects
pas
are
de
being
connexion
developed,
possible,
and if
ils
there's no
utilisent leurs
possibility to
propres
connect to
turbines. Donc, si
the
on veut
grid,
éviter
they
ça,
use their
il est
own
absolument nécessaire
gas turbines.
de s'assurer
So
qu'on choisit bien
we really
l'utilisation des
need
data centers,
to
et qu'on
choose
réfléchit à l'ensemble
where
des
the
systèmes
data
associés.
centers are to
Et
be
pour ça, encore une
installed,
fois,
and
l'Europe a une carte à
Europe
jouer, évidemment par l'intensité
has a
carbone
trump card
de
here.
l'Europe. Certaines régions sont froides.
Some regions are
de refroidissement
colder, so you need less cooling, for instance, than in Arizona. And the grid is there.
De la stratégie européenne, on a en tout cas la
So,
possibilité dans le déploiement
regarding the European strategy,
le
Europe
déploiement
can
data
be a
centers
player and
and
avoid data centers in regions where the impact is much greater.
Voilà, donc ça c'était sur la partie data center, et je voulais maintenant faire un
So
autre
that was for the
zoom,
data centers,
sur
but
la
I'd
partie
now like to
modèle.
focus
C'est vrai
on
qu'on a
the
aussi
models.
à utiliser par défaut ChatGPT.
We tend to go to ChatGPT and Anthropic and not to give it much thought because they're easy to access, but all AIs are not equal. There are larger and smaller ones, and I think we have to start being more careful when we choose the models we're going to use, accessing the various services. There's a recent example, which is Cursor in the US. Coders here probably know it. It helps developers to code automatically. And the code quality is good. Up to then, it was mainly OpenAI. You see these in the middle, Opus and GPT. And there's another one, Composer, and they have been able to surpass these models, these large models. So we have small language models, at least smaller than the large language models, and it yields comparable results. So rather than using a larger model which can answer a greater number of questions, it's sometimes better to have a specific AI for a specific use. So that was my first comment following the news we just heard, and it's based on Kimi, a Chinese open source model, and the specific capabilities are based on open source, usually developed by Chinese R&D teams. That's what you see here on the right. In red, it's the share of model sources from China, and it's on the increase. So in geopolitical terms, it may be the beginnings of Chinese soft power over AI, because there are OpenAI or Anthropic are proprietary, whereas the Chinese models are accessible through open source for specific models. So this is the example of a specific model developed for coding assistance, rather like what is done in medicine or what we do for geology. So takeaways here would be that all data centers aren't equal, and you can pick and choose. All AIs do not have the same impact, so as a consumer or as a government, there are choices to be made. And you may have heard about Starclock, which is a startup which wants to develop data centers in space, starting with 200 million. So we have to be able to face the challenges. There'll always be a solution, but putting data centers in space may not be the most pragmatic solution.
Merci Aymeric. Donc, vous avez entendu. que dans les solutions.
Well, you've heard that in the solutions just put forward, there's the geopolitical aspect, which has to be taken on board. We can't always do what we'd like to do, because where you put the data center is already an issue. You first need the necessary agreements, and then there are vulnerabilities which come into play. So there are consequences, there are power struggles. And we're going to hear more from Henri.
Bonjour à tous. C'est terrible de parler le dernier parce que
Well, I'm sorry to be speaking last because I really like to enter into discussions with those who've already spoken. I have just spent 7 years as France's digital ambassador, and 40 years ago we were already programming with AI. So there are things that have already been around and are known about by scientists. And so here I'd like to put out 3 ideas. First of all, you all said it, or at least Claude said it. It's the anthropological aspect. For me, it's like writing. 3 times throughout humankind, we have done this sort of thing, mechanizing memory, and then calculators, and now this. So that is mechanizing the expression of self. So this is a major revolution, but it's happening at the end of the quiet time. International relations are becoming more and more tumultuous, with Trump, Putin, Xi, maybe India as well, thinking that the world order should be a shock between cultural empires. That democracy is something of the past, and things that were unthinkable 15 years ago are becoming the new normal. Bad luck, but that's how it is. So with this brutal atmosphere, countries feel that their IT industry is of utmost importance. The propaganda that is around has made people think that we, with the Americans, were here to oppose the rest of the world. Europe dominated the world for a couple of centuries after the Industrial Revolution, and it's starting again, so we mustn't fall into the trap. AI is a new system for domination. Most of the BRICS, for instance, say we are going to be an AI center, we won't get trodden on, etc. So it's a source of power in a world which is more and more fraught with conflicts. And those who have AI consider that they are very important assets. So we have an American here on the panel from the US. The US is a large country which has often broken down monopolies, and right now is letting a monopoly prosper without doing anything about it. In Washington, what people think is that the US's asset in its competition against China is its IT base. There are companies that are superpowers, and it's a little difficult to imagine here at the Mine. It's a place that did a lot for France, and we knew how to manage companies like Saint-Gobain in a friendly way, but we now have private political operators, and they want to play a geopolitical role. Mr. Musk would be a case in point, changing his mind frequently, wanting to overturn the president of the Supreme Court in Brazil, a private political player. And let me add, well, I don't know whether it's true or not, but in AI, which is funded by risk capital, and that is something that we're not really used to. These are companies, basically, which have come to be based on gambles. So the feeling is that we're only a month away from what they call general AI. That machines will be smarter than humans, and other AIs will be therefore developed by the large AI. So it's a kind of arms race, which I think is crazy. And then you say, yes, okay, you've got market concentration, you've got the electrical power issue, you're losing minor languages, you're fighting a losing battle. And then you have those who say, don't slow down, don't give it any thought, let it happen. Now, maybe as ambassador for digital matters, I felt that it was very bizarre that President Trump say, I'm going to stop supporting Ukraine, and then Zelensky said, hang on, we've got all the European rare earth, and then he said, let's lay our hands on Canada with hydroelectric, and then there was Greenland. These are three very bizarre statements, but it's all percolating. It's all related to AI. Now, to connect back to today's topic, I'm a bit of a digital veteran. I set up my first company in 1995. It's a matter of community, of open standards and free software, to put it that way. But AI is quite different. There's this material aspect to it. But you can't really see it clearly because it's distributed, but you need the rare earth, you need all this industrial infrastructure. And there are those who have a monopoly over the production of chips. You could practically write the story of AI as you would the exchange of flows. Of course, you need data centers, you need to transport data, and it's no surprise that 80% of underwater cables have been laid these past years by the GAFAM. So it's a very material industry. Now, to answer the question that you let me have before this meeting, let me say that you can no longer think in terms of AI without thinking about strategic autonomy. And that's an autonomy which means that industrial policies need to be relevant. Let me just put it out there. Personally speaking, I think the US are suggesting we take part in a race that we're bound to lose. They say that only a gigantic $500 million infrastructure can overcome. You have China, you have India, to a certain extent Europe. That said, you don't always need gigantic models. In fact, you don't often need it, only for about 10% of uses. If you have good open source solutions which are locally relevant, it'll use less energy. It's probably more relevant. We're talking about geology. Why would you? Of course, you're talking about something which has been fed and educated. You don't need all that because it becomes less relevant. So there is Chinese soft power. It's quite impressive because it's backed up by an industrial base with a lot of open source and a great number of local solutions. And it should be an inspiration, but we must also remember we need to be autonomous in terms of material. Public debate is a lot about the location of data centers, but it's not really about that. Of course, there's the energy aspect, but you have to look at jurisdictions as well. If you have data centers in France under US law, where the US administration doesn't need to go to court in order to lay its hands on data. So the jurisdiction that applies, I think, is even more important than other considerations. And then there are the technical standards. If your data center can be shut down remotely simply by cutting off the power, so you've got to think a little further. Things aren't necessarily impossible, but a country, an enterprise, an economy can't rest on something where a player remotely can put a stop to it all. Judge Guillou at the International Criminal Court started an investigation into Gaza. Trump applied legislation which had been drafted to catch bin Laden and said Judge Guillou could no longer pay for anything in dollars, not even European services, because there's always some part of the process which goes through dollars because you go through PayPal or because the delivery service is American. So back to the 1990s, simply on a whim, which took only 5 minutes. Any French company could be in the same situation. The same could happen to them.
Merci beaucoup, Henri, pour ce développement assez...
Well, thank you very much. This was most instructive. Quite a few details there. So now we're going to try and tackle your questions. I have one here for Louis. AI models, is there a standard way which is accepted in science to measure consumption? Or from what I know, it's not really my area, but from what I know, it's extremely difficult. It's complicated because not many people are interested in this, and furthermore, I think that's true also when you try to measure the environmental impact of anything. The question is, where do you start? Are you talking about the use? You're talking about the development, where there was a lot of training, maybe with smaller data sets. You're going to look at the energy impact of setting up the data centers and manufacturing the chips. Where do you start? So that's not an easy one. And from what I have read recently is, as we go along, we know less and less. And it's compounded by the fact that the largest consumers, the GAFAM and others, have been very quiet as to what data has been used, what the sizes of their data centers, and what use has been made. It becomes increasingly unclear. Several initiatives have started, but for now, there isn't a consensus, nor do we have answers to the questions. And so it's really the life cycle that you have to take into account. A big comment. There's been some interesting process at the CGD trying to develop a standard which would be the European, a model which would be the European standard. But you just said it. If I'm measuring transport, I can work out what it costs to transport 1 kilo over 1 kilometer. But with AI, what are we talking about? One pixel? What's the standard? Yes, metrics need to be clarified.
I have a question for you, Éric. You know that the US, they get rid of any constraint regarding energy. They even get out of the Paris Agreement. So the question is, what are the rules that apply to data center in the US regarding energy constraint?
At the national level, there are no rules. In fact, there are, well, because the US is governed by a lot of state-level governments, county-level governments, very many layers. So what we're seeing is a bit of a patchwork playing out in the US. There are some places that are requiring renewable energy. There are some places that are banning data centers until they can put sustainability guardrails in. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are plenty of places that are welcoming data centers, shortening interconnect queues, allowing on-site generation and so forth. So data centers right now in the US can more or less move wherever they can get power and where they have the fewest restrictions. So we don't have a national cohesive policy that enforces a certain set of sustainability guidelines for all data centers. Rather, it's playing out at very local levels. But as that's happening, data centers aren't stopping their builds. They're moving to places where they can build faster, more, with whatever energy they can get. So that's the situation now. And I don't see under the current administration any move towards sustainability regulations at the federal level. It's happening at the state level.
So can we say that the decision regarding data center deployment or even installation are just based on the cost, let's say it like that?
Like many business decisions, it does come down to cost, but right now what's driving it is, can they get enough power and quickly? Sometimes water is a consideration, sometimes having available fiber is a consideration. So the traditional considerations around data center siting haven't gone away. It's just that power, access to power as soon as possible is really the dominant one. And there are some jurisdictions like Texas or other states which are putting in incentives, tax incentives, other incentives to bring data centers in to their states for economic reasons. Tax revenues, maybe some jobs quite small for data centers, that sort of thing. So data center operators can find a place that's conducive to what they want to build just by shopping around in the US, essentially.
And some of them are located outside the US. Why?
You mean data centers that are run by US companies? Google,
yes,
Amazon,
like Amazon, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're all over the world, right? I mean, these are the companies that own the largest fleets.
Elles sont localisées partout. Il y a des flottes de centres de données qui forment un réseau mondial. Donc, ces sociétés ont l'expertise, le capital, tout ce qui, depuis des décennies, leur a permis d'avoir une présence mondiale. Mais pour ce qui est des data centers qui opèrent l'IA, même les data centers américains, mais elles sont localisées aux États-Unis pour des raisons de confidentialité, des données ou autres. Ces data centers qui font fonctionner l'IA sont surtout construits aux États-Unis. Pas exclusivement, mais ça donne quand même lieu à beaucoup de croissance aux États-Unis. Merci beaucoup. One question for you, Aymeric. What are the main obstacles? I have a question now concerning mining and AI. What is the linkage there?
qu'on observe dans l'univers de la géologie
Well,
et dans,
I think
dans le
what
domaine
we
des
see in geology and
géosciences est
geoscience
probablement assez similaire à ce
is
qu'on observe dans l'ensemble des domaines
very
scientifiques.
similar
C'est-à-dire
to what we're seeing in
qu'on a historiquement
other
il y a
areas of
eu
science.
historiquement une vision
Historically,
de l'IA associée au machine learning et à la data
AI
science.
was
Donc,
associated machine
on
learning
avait,
and data
les
science.
data scientists arrivaient avec des
Data
modèles qui étaient des modèles
scientists came in with
purement data,
models that were
et donc
only
avec
data-driven or
parfois une forme de scepticisme
data-based.
de la part des experts
They were
dans le
viewed
domaine
with
de compétences qui
skepticism
disaient,
from
nous, ça fait
by experts in
des décennies,
other
des décennies
areas
qu'on
of
développe des
expertise. They were
modèles physiques,
saying,
des
well,
modèles
we've
chimiques, des
been
modèles de
developing
toutes sortes, qui
physical
sont pas des
chemical
modèles
models
data,
for
mais qui ont
years.
un
They're not
fondement,
data models, but
physico-chimique.
they are built
Ce qui est
on
intéressant
physical
avec la
chemical
nouvelle, alors avec la
foundations.
nouvelle vague de modèles d'IA,
And with a
c'est
new
que
wave
on
of
intègre
AI
beaucoup plus
models, what
fortement
we see is that
la
there's
réalité physique et les first
more
principles
integration
de la physique et de
of
la chimie
physical
dans les modèles. Donc
reality
là où il y avait une sorte
into
de
the models.
dichotomie entre
So there
d'un
used to be
côté des
this
modèles physiques,
dichotomy
des
between
modèles
physical
basés
models
sur les lois de la physique et de la chimie, et de l'autre côté des modèles
grounded in the
data.
laws of physics and
On arrive à un moment
chemistry
où
and
on
data
a ce qu'on appelle
models.
le physics AI qui
And
se
now we
développe
have physics AI, which is really developing fast in the US in particular, that natively incorporate the laws of physics and chemistry in their models. So that's what we do with the laws of geology. We do metallogenics, for example. What's at the heart of the models we're developing is the question, where does metal come from? Why did it accumulate in the subsoil? What is the physical, chemical, geological phenomena that explain why all that metal accumulated in this or that place? And what we see now is a convergence between purely data models and purely physical models, and now they have become unified. And that is true about the generation of models like transformers that are being explored today. OpenAI, Mistral, Anthropic are now developing that. And it is even truer in terms of, and you've probably heard about Yann LeCun's model based on Moore models. It's a concept where you integrate physical reality right at the core of the model. So for a long time, there was skepticism over models which just turned their backs on decades of research, scientific research, and now the models incorporate that complexity and, in fact, help and foster development and research in complex areas. Thank you very much. So instead of considering AI as an adversary of traditional, conventional metals, now we're seeing convergence. And so knowledge is very important to make these models, to give them a higher performance. So a question for Henri. Someone is saying, we get the sense today that we no longer have a choice of saying whether we want AI or don't want AI. And so the global economy is forming around AI. We have no say in the matter anymore. What do you think? Well, that's an excellent remark. It's at least on the scale of an industrial revolution. I mean, I'm speaking from an anthropological perspective. We are entering an AI generation. Doesn't mean that we need to absolutely swallow every single marketing-related argument, as was said earlier. I mean, I'm glad my two 19, 21-year-old daughters are educating me. They're telling me, don't use AI as instead of Google, learn to do your own research. I was the government's DSI, as it were, and I prototyped the role of CTO for the government. I recruited 4 data scientists. We used to go and see government agencies saying, hey, we're here to resolve your problems. And so we had about 30 assignments over a couple of years, sometimes very complex. For example, working with government procurement to optimize our power procurement contracts over several years. So it was quite complex. And after a few years, the data scientists told me, Henri, we're a little bored. But I said, but you're doing the most magnificent assignments in the world. They said, yeah, okay, but over the past 10 years, we've never needed more than linear regressions and Excel spreadsheets. Well, that's because you don't need any more than that. And so that idea of being frugal, of asking yourself, why am I doing this? Well, the idea that we have no choice, no say in the matter, it's worrying, but it's also false. I was talking to an admiral this week, and you know that the captain of our nuclear submarine first trains on a sailing ship. Well, because if you want to be the highest ranking commander on the best warship or a submarine, they have to know about navigating with instruments and with the wind, etc. And that is why our developers need to work alone without AI helping them if that needs to, if things turn out that way. And can they actually do that? Well, hence the interest of working with open source instruments. Now, I may be repeating myself. I set up my first company in 1995. Remember, we used to compress code because otherwise it took up too much memory. I mean, it was craftsmanship. We were like goldsmiths. So that was 30 years ago. And now the entire market is asking us to become lazy. No need to know where your data is. It's somewhere up there in the cloud, which is wrong, It's false. It makes you think that it's diffuse up there. No, it's in Fort Knox somewhere. Don't need to prepare your operations. Big data is going to help you. But what is that? It means everything is massively parallel. I have 10 machines working in parallel. Don't need to think about my computation. It's like brute force. Then we were told, don't need structured archives. You got the blockchain. You can archive all of history since Adam and Eve. Yeah, except you look for one file, you're turning on an entire nuclear power plant. Now it's, just use an AI prompt, a few words, whatever. So it's an invitation to be slothful and to use plenty of energy. No, I like working with geeks, hackers who love code, and they cringe at the idea. They do things differently, want to do things differently. You don't need to jump on the consumeristic, lazy, energy-intensive bandwagon. And I think that we need to embrace alternatives. Just to top up on what you said, there is a real issue today. How do young developers who learned their trade 10, 20, 30 years ago by making mistakes, by typing lines of code, identifying their mistakes? The real question is, how do we teach them to code today when they have tools that will code for them? The good tool users today are those who learn to hand code for years. And so they are the ones that give these tools their relevance because they use them as assistants who just replicate what they already know how to do themselves intrinsically. The new generation will not have troubleshot their own code writing. I'll intervene as a teacher. We're asking ourselves the same question in a bunch of disciplines. We have to revisit all the exercises and assignments we give our students. We don't give an assignment because we need to know the answer. We know the answer. It's about teaching young people to think for themselves. But, we're still teaching young children how to count when we've had calculators for such a long while. It was the same thing in diplomacy. So I worked for the Foreign Ministry for 7 years. And as you know, diplomats are trained kind of through a mentorship system. So they are twinned up with someone who supervises them for a while until they can fly on their own. And now they can do reports using AI because it's easier. But if we can't mentor anymore, we don't know how we're going to train these future diplomats. If you just give me a minute, I'd like to add something. You may know Hannah Lambert, a philosopher who thinks a lot about AI, and you may or may know that Plato and Socrates gawked at the invention of writing because they said, well, you're not going to be able to memorize anything anymore if you can write things down. That's one thing. Secondly, in the social order, educated people, mostly men, were recognizable because they had memorized thousands of verses, for example, all of Homer, for example. And now and the people who came in with the handwritten notes and looked at them 5 minutes before whatever conference, etc., Plato and Socrates thought that was crazy. But what is it now? The next generation said, well, I'm going to set up an academy because I need to teach these people who know new tools in a new way. And it's the same thing here. We need to create that academios. How do we train young people? What is the freedom we give them? The same thing for Plato several thousand years ago. Well, you remember at the origins of computing, there was a fundamental question related to AI. Actually, it was the Turing test. You know the Turing test. Microphone, please. So it's a machine. It's an AI machine, Turing's machine. And after a while, you knew that the machine had passed the test when you couldn't tell whether the result was produced by a human or a machine. And Turing said, when you're no longer able to make the distinction, that's when the machine is starting to learn. But it's worse today. If you give an assignment to students today that they're supposed to do at home, they come back with something that was been fed to them by AI. And you, as a professor, you're assessing them. You have to know whether, where that solution came from, the student or AI. It's very, very difficult. And you have the reverse as well. Today, when you go onto a website, AI is asking you to prove that you're a human. So it's loop-de-loop, really. So, Aymeric, what advice would you give young geologists, not necessarily young, but they're just starting out in geology, using AI? How do you tell them to use AI or not? Well, that's an excellent question. So, firstly, do they have to use it or not? I don't know. But at least your starting point has to be the question, is AI going to change the work for geologists? Today, in my toolbox, I think it is best to have some kind of AI culture or knowledge. I do think that geology will start to embrace AI. And so it's important to understand, at least basically, how AI works, how models work. To understand what powers the AI, not just be a passive user, but an informed user that understands the algorithm. So when a model recommends probes to be taken this way or that way, understand why. And not just be there and say, right, here's our sampling plan, I'm going to just apply it, no questions asked. So you have to understand how the model works to understand how to use it. That's what gives it its relevance. That's how you keep control over it. And that requires an understanding of how models work. And so I think that geologists, those who study geology, also need to have a module in AI. Because geologists have to do mapping, 3D modeling. And at Lithosquare, what we do is that we pre-generate subsoil 3D maps using 3D modeling. It's very time-saving. It opens up amazing opportunities, but we keep the human in the loop, and we really believe in that. AI must be seen as a tool, and only a tool, with human control. Thank you very much.
Éric, why, I don't know why he says it, but why is gas preferred for data center in the United States? Some large remote mines are now powered by the renewable energy production up to 90%, and the remaining 10% from diesel. Is this a potential model for data center?
Could you repeat the second part? I heard the first part about natural gas, which I can address for sure.
Yeah, he says that some large remote mines are now powered by their own renewable energy production, up to 90%, and the remaining 10% from diesel. And he asked if this model is a potential one that will be like standard.
Great question. So to answer the first one, the U.S. has a lot of gas, a lot of natural gas from a history of fracking. So natural gas is usually quite cheap and plentiful. The infrastructure is there in the United States. And one challenge with large data centers connecting to existing grids is they don't have, well, first of all, the existing grids don't have the capacity. Second, they don't have the substations and all the interconnect transmission distribution equipment needed to connect those data centers. And there are companies that make much smaller generating sets for backup power or on-site power at remote locations that have a lot of inventory. So take cheap natural gas, the availability of small turbines, and the need for these companies, whether we believe them or not, to build as quickly as possible. And those are the reasons why we're seeing a lot of natural gas generation. I suppose the fourth one is these are data centers that would be quite large. They're aspirationally looking at a 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatt, 3 gigawatt scale. And so while it is viable to power those data centers with renewables, there's simply not the capacity for that, and often there's not the land area if we're thinking about solar photovoltaics and so forth, and at least not in the near term. So that's the reason why we're seeing most of the additional generation being added in the US relying on natural gas. And the companies that are doing so, they often have net zero targets. So this is one of the hard things about analyzing the data center sector. On the one hand, we can see with our eyes that they're building out new fossil fuel infrastructure. But on the other hand, for every megawatt they invest in natural gas, they're investing in a renewable project somewhere else, maybe down in Chile, a wind farm. They're investing quite heavily in next generation power sources like enhanced geothermal or, Google is touting fusion someday, right? And they claim credits for that in their carbon balance sheets. So they are investing in renewables, and there are places in the US that are forcing them to adopt more renewables. But in the short term, given the factors that I mentioned, they're all moving to natural gas because it's available, it's cheap, it's quick, they have the infrastructure, and there aren't strong guardrails to keep them from adopting it.
Thank you very much, Eric. Une autre question pour toi, Henri.
Here's another question for Henri. For Henri, is it realistic to think that based on our that our sensitive data in Europe, health-related, etc., can be kept in France or Europe, but be combined with international data to serve the goals of science? Yes. Any restrictions? Yes, restrictions, of course. Since I've become a digital diplomat, these issues of science have really struck me. We've seen problems with observance of regulations, etc. And so the question of infrastructure, if you're an engineer, you can think of all sorts of ways to format the data, make it transparent, provisional access, reversible access. So as a data hub is very interesting infrastructure. 700 research projects in health, for example, were launched via this mechanism. Now, this is something that happened a few weeks ago. I presented the people from the Alzheimer Hub to some Indians who put together DEPA, Data, Empower, and Privacy Architecture. So for 2 years, they were saying our solution is the best. We'll never share data with anywhere else, send it abroad. And then Presidents Macron and Prime Minister Modi in Delhi 2 months ago said, or combined the Indian and French system. So it's co-sovereignty, or it's the balance of terror, if you like. Each party looking over the other one's shoulder. And now we have Indian and French hospital data that's being crossed or used in the AI systems. And here's another similar question. What is the role of the French digital ambassador, the French digital policy in this race to AI? What role can they play? Oh, for 8 years, I've been called the ambassador of digital technology. No, I don't represent digital technology. I represent France. So this is not an unfamiliar question. But the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not dictate the R&D policy, the industrial policy, and so on. So the roles. Well, it's a role of diplomacy, setting up partnerships, alliances. We were able to promote French businesses, facilitate research agreements, student exchanges. So that's the diplomacy side of things. But also what's important is that we were a major actor in developing the thinking over AI governance. Last year, we had the Paris Summit on AI. I was in charge of the governance track. The result is modest but important as well. We had 200 representatives representing 40 countries, 100 businesses, civil society, researchers, and we decided together to map all of the topics that should fall under the governance rubric. And everybody talks about governance in their own little area. Well, there's a problem in energy, there's an issue here, etc. But there are plenty of issues. 92% of AI's training data are in English. And the rest of the world accounts for 8% of the data, so that's a problem. The software speaks to you in French, but it's not thinking in French. For example, they think that it's the Wright brothers that invented aviation. We know in France that it was Clement Adler. And really, ask ChatGPT in French who invented the aircraft. If you ask in English, rather, they'll say the Wright brothers. Ask Gemini, the Wright brothers. But in French, they'll answer Clement Adler. Ask Mistral AI, Clement Adler. Because the French language model was trained on the French intellectual property data. Therefore, Clement Adler invented the word aviation. So sorry, I got waylaid. I digressed. So at least we got an international consensus around, backtracking, governance. Governance doesn't mean regulation. It can mean open standards, voluntary standards, and so on. But so we agreed that there were many, many issues, such as market concentration. That's why the US did not sign off on our final document. The biggest problem for me in AI, as we alluded to, is that if you have just 3 monopolistic companies that have a hold on AI and also become techno-fascist, that's a real problem. We can't leave the market in the hands of techno-fascist multi-billionaires. We also agreed on the fact that it was important for all countries to have skills, to train citizens in AI. So that is probably falls in the category of AI governance, as well as the distribution of assets. Public research, we said if there's no public funded research, there's no future. We have to understand what businesses are doing. And so we really tried to build up a consensus on some topics that require some form of global governance. Thank you very much, Henri. That anecdote about aviation, the Brazilians will say it's a Brazilian, Santos Dumont. Santos Dumont, another big aviator. Here's another more broad question, perhaps the last one, for Chloé. So we've been talking about the environmental impact of AI, but there are other concerns. But let's look at this one. So what recommendations could we formulate about about AI usage in terms of the environmental impact, taking all those concerns into consideration? Well, that's a big question. A number of aspects have already been addressed. But I'll tell you what concerns me is that we're still talking in personal terms. I am going to avoid looking something up using AI instead of a regular Google search using my own brain. I use a LLM, etc., or I will choose to code manually. These choices are all personal. And, well, let me give you an example. Take agentic AI today. You have some forms of AI that will entirely take over someone's job. Jobs are being lost as we speak, completely replaced by AI. These are social repercussions, social impact, but it's also an excessive use of AI that too will have implications in terms of the energy bill. Do you think that that is just the way of things? We should just, let go, or should we regulate? Well, those are huge questions. Should we? How can we regulate that sort of thing? I think the question you need to ask yourselves about lost jobs, for example, is what are those jobs? Are they fulfilling jobs? Up until now, whenever jobs were being automated, it was about automating tasks that were repetitive, not entirely gratifying, and that were repetitive, so they could be automated, for example, assembly lines. So our society is based on having a job. How else can you make a living? Perhaps there are other forms of society and that do not entirely revolve on being on an assembly line 8 hours a day. So AI is now replacing more creative work as well as writing or translation. And can we continue thinking from the same place? Doesn't matter, some jobs are lost, some jobs are gained. No, I think we have to rethink perhaps our society. And what people in creative jobs are saying, they are saying that yes, they would like an assistant for the repetitive tasks, but they don't want to be replaced when they create images. They want to spend more time creating images. And now they're being told, no, that bit can be automated. You just go home and do your household chores. You'll have more time to do them. So yes, I think we are in front of a huge development. But it seems difficult to me to oblige a company to use a person rather than a digital agent if the digital agent does at least as good a job and in any case costs less. So I think it's an issue that relates to the organizations of society and not just the uses of AI. We are also at a time of economic difficulties with a lot of layoffs and so on. Yes, well, this debate is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Something surprising, a lot of people take for granted that if you increase productivity, jobs will be lost. Others are going to say, no, go back to Schumpeter. The consequences will be different. Over the past century, we've doubled productivity. And neither of the two scenarios we talked about took place. Well, jobs changed. Yes, but not necessarily in a good way. There are ultra-rich people. There are more and more bullshit jobs. And I think the father of that expression is entirely right. People still want people to work under them or to be someone else's boss. So you can't say that effects are mechanical, and sometimes we don't learn from history. We've already doubled productivity. Yes, but that goes beyond AI, doesn't it? Yeah, but I think that what was predicted about AI isn't happening. Right, this is more of a political debate then.
A quien quiere celeste que le cueste, c'est-à-dire celui qui veut le ciel qui en coûte le prix. Donc je pense que le développement lié à
I think, it will cost what it must cost. We can't deny the potential advantages. We've managed to stick to time. Thank you so much for actively partaking